Here our question is, what is temperance? What is sophrosune? What happens is that Charmides, and then later Critias, give us a variety of attempted definitions. Scholars identify at least 5 definitions in this dialogue. Some say 6. I actually count 8 being considered in this dialogue, and I want to go through those 8, at least briefly, to see what's being said. All of them have some foundation. All of them have some connection to temperance. So none of them are really just from out of left field. Nevertheless, Socrates thinks none of them captures fully what's going on with the nature of temperance. So let's start with the first of these. To act temperately, Charmides says, is to behave in an orderly and quiet way. And indeed, that does seem to be part of what the temperate person is like. And in later dialogues, in The Statesman, for example, the statesman who is thought to be temperate does have those qualities. So this is not an absurd thing to say. It's to carry yourself with a certain deportment. Now, Socrates rejects this, partly because he says, with respect to some examples involving the body and some involving the mind, in matters of running, let's say, or wrestling, or boxing, is it better to be slow and quiet, or to be fast and energetic? Charmides says, well, it's better to be fast and energetic. And what about matters of the mind? Teaching, learning, isn't it better to be energetic than to be slow and restrained? He says, well, yes. And so the idea emerges, well then look, if we assume, and here's another key background assumption, that virtues are good, and in fact they're always good, so temperance must be something that is good, and moreover always good. So he says, look, if temperance is then slowness and quietness, where the slow... Now, wait, you might say, what do you mean slow? Where does slow come in here? We were talking about something being orderly and quiet. And being orderly does seem important to teaching, to learning, to a variety of other things. So we could say, well, I'm not convinced that this argument really quite works. But the thought here is that in all of these cases, it's not necessarily good to exhibit quietness as opposed to, well, energy, as opposed to something that is not so orderly perhaps, and not really so quiet. We could think about a variety of examples of this. So even if we don't like his examples because of the slowness brought in, we might think it's possible in principle to give some examples that are better, where in fact it's better not to be orderly. Now, we're not going to be able to refer to things like running and teaching and learning, but maybe in boxing it is better. You've got to surprise the other person. Got to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. If you do this in an orderly way, predictable way, then you're going to be in trouble. And the same might be true of military strategy and battle. You don't want to proceed in a quiet, orderly way. Some things, yes, have to be done quietly and orderly, but other things you really want to do with surprise. You want to be unpredictable. So in short, there are probably examples we can give to beef up this argument and avoid that connection with slowness. But I think there's a deeper point, and that is that this is strictly a behavioral, external consideration. Is somebody temperate or not? Can we tell by just looking at their actions, looking at the way they behave from the outside? It doesn't seem as if that's right. Really, somebody who is moderate, who is self-controlled, we have to judge that in part by looking at their state of mind. It's not something we can examine just from the outside. And indeed, somebody who is going to be temperate, it's not like they are never going to get excited, never going to be spontaneous, never going to be unpredictable or energetic or whatever else we think is the opposite of this. The question really has to do with, you might say, why they're doing this and what is happening inside them. So you might think the deeper problem here really is that this is a strictly behavioral consideration. That's not what's really going on. When we attribute a virtue, it's not just about what a person does externally, it's about what's going on in part, internally. So that does seem like a deeper problem. Let's move on to the second definition. Charmides says that, well, temperance is a question of modesty or a sense of shame. The person who is temperate is modest, is restrained, has a sense of shame, is wary about doing things that might produce shame. Now, there is again a point to this. It does feel as if the person who is self-controlled is concerned not to do anything shameful, and is modest, is restrained, and so we could say, yes, there's a point to this. On the other hand, is this right? Is it the case that everybody who is temperate, is self-controlled, also has a sense of modesty, has a sense of shame? Does that capture the essence of what's going on here? Now, what happens in the dialogue at this point is rather surprising. Socrates quotes Homer, and the quotation is this: "Modesty or a sense of shame is not good for a needy man." Well, that makes some sense for a sense of shame. It's a little hard to see what's going on with modesty. But in any case, the thought is, in not all circumstances is modesty a good thing. It's not always good to have a sense of shame. Sometimes there's nothing to be ashamed about. Sometimes the problem is really, you can't be modest. You've got to stick up for yourself. And so, if we assume that temperance is something that is always good, then this is not something always good. Again, we could worry about that background assumption. Why should we think that a virtue is always good? Why not think it's just generally good, but there can be exceptions? In any case, the assumption here is it's always good, and so if there are cases where this is not good, then it can't be temperance. But I think, again, there's something a little deeper. Two things are happening. First of all, modesty. You might think that's really something happening internally, but we want to make sure it's reflected in proper behavior, behavior that fits and is good in the situation, and modesty isn't always like that. The second problem is a sense of shame, insofar as we think about that, seems relational or external in some way, to depend on the attitudes of others. But when we're talking about this fundamental virtue, we shouldn't have it depend on the attitudes of other people. We want this to be something that's true of a person, intrinsically or internally or something like that. Not some, here I don't mean just strictly non-behaviorally, but something that we can describe in terms of the qualities of that person, him or herself, not in terms of their relation to a social setting. So it looks as if that's in some way wrong. It's not that a question of shame, what's shameful, might depend on the attitudes of the other people around you. We don't want this to depend on those attitudes in that way. Well, at that point, Charmides resorts to a third definition. Definition 3 is that this is a matter of doing one's own job, doing your own thing. And this is something that a reader of the Republic should immediately recognize. This is the definition that Socrates himself advocates of justice in the Republic. But here, Charmides is putting it forward as a definition of temperance. Socrates raises an objection. If this is a matter of doing your own business, well then, it looks like lots of people are involved in service, and for that matter, producing things for others, and so don't actually stick to their own business. The doctor, for example, is someone who helps patients. The lawyer has clients. The person who is a builder or a weaver is producing products for other people. The shoemaker does the same thing. And so you might think in all of these cases, they're not doing their own business, they're doing someone else's business. I think it's most obvious with respect to an agent, someone like an attorney, for example, or a real estate agent who is doing business on behalf of someone else. Maybe a political representative in a democratic system is doing something similar. And that looks like, well, look, they're doing the people's business. They're doing their client's business. They're not doing their own business. Yet surely it's possible for such a person to be temperate. It's interesting the way this goes in the dialogue, because Socrates never actually criticizes this definition. Instead, he moves on. And so it's somewhat surprising. We expect in each case for the thing to have the following form, roughly. Is this definition clear enough to analyze? And then if it is it too broad or too narrow? Are there cases of false positives where basically it satisfies the terms of the definition, but doesn't really exhibit, in this case, temperance? Or do we have a case here where instead we have a false negative, where it doesn't meet the terms of the definition, but actually it is a good case of temperance? Here we don't really get anything like that. We do get this idea that, well, look, it looks like these people are, you can be temperate and be involved in the doing of services to others, even representing someone else's interests. But Critias quickly steps in here and says, look, you've got to draw some distinctions. They are doing their own business by doing this. That is to say, an agent, to take, I think, the best example, yes, the real estate agent is doing their business by doing their client's business. And so it's not as if they're doing their client's business in place of doing their own business. That's what their own job is. And so that's not a counterexample to the idea that temperance is doing your own job. Maybe a more serious matter would be, well, they've got to do it well, don't they? And I think maybe that's what motivates Socrates to say, surely the agent isn't then automatically, just by virtue of being a real estate agent, or a builder or a weaver, a cobbler, or anything like this, automatically temperate. They've got to do their proper job. They've got to do what they're supposed to be doing, and they've got to do it well. And so he says, really, this definition ends up collapsing into another one, which is the doing of good works, the doing of good things. And so that's the fourth definition. Temperance is a matter of doing good things. But now we get another important assumption about the nature of temperance. He says somebody who is acting temperately knows they're acting temperately. Someone who is temperate knows that they are temperate. Now this already tells us that Charmides can't really be temperate, because after all, he professed not to know whether he was temperate. And so we should already worry, so maybe Charmides isn't as temperate as advertised, isn't as virtuous as advertised. And of course, given the historical background, the reader is going to pick up on that and say, yes, I see what's happening here. But in this case, if we assume that there is a self-awareness to this, and if we think of this as a matter of self-control, yeah, if you're exerting self-control, you're aware that you're exerting self-control. And so this is a fairly plausible idea. But the thought is you can do good actions without that kind of awareness. I might do something good without even being aware that I'm doing it. But I can't exhibit self-control without being aware that I'm doing it. And so that tells us this can't be what temperance really is. At this point, Critias takes a very different tack. Fifth definition is that temperance is self-knowledge. He says, in fact, the Delphic oracle, when it says, know thyself, might as well just say, be temperate. Have this virtue of sophrosune, because in fact, they come to the same thing. Now, again, we would expect there to be a serious examination of this, a search for false positives and false negatives. We don't get that. Instead, what Socrates does is transform this into definition number 6, which is that temperance is the knowledge of itself. Now, it seems to me that's a rather strange transformation, and Critias goes along with it, somewhat surprisingly, because to know oneself and to have a virtue that is involved in awareness of itself seem like two different things. One is knowing you, the other is a matter of knowing that very trait of yours. And maybe there's some relation there. If you truly know yourself, then you must know that trait, I suppose. But it looks as if those are rather different things. In any case, Socrates, if we are generous here, might be thought to be assuming that if you are to know yourself, and we've already said that you can't be temperate without being aware of this. Exerting self-control means being aware of exerting self-control. Then maybe it's not so crazy to think that this is a virtue that has the very special property of being aware of itself. That kind of self-knowledge, self-awareness is something uniquely characteristic of temperance.